Hello and welcome. As I continue to develop my reading plans for 2025, always having an eye on those goals that I developed a few weeks ago, I decided that I wanted to have a list of authors that I want to read more of their work. So I have a tendency that once I find an author that I really love, I try to find their works and read more of them. And sometimes it backfires. Sometimes it was just that particular book or series that I liked, and the rest of the works really were not my favorite. But I do, once I find an author that I like, think, I should probably read more of their works. So today I'm going to share what authors for me are sort of auto reserve at the library, or auto reserve on Libby, or maybe even trying to find some used books on thrift books of specific authors for me to read in 2025. I am going to share these books in categories. So the first category is classics. And the first author is Elizabeth Goudge. I love Elizabeth Goudge's works. I actually have managed over the years to collect quite a few of them in vintage condition, if at all possible. They are increasingly getting more and more expensive as she regains popularity, which is marvelous, I think. But I did count on my shelf. I have 7 books that I have not read of hers, and there are 1 or 2 more that I don't actually have on my shelf. A lot of those 7 books are, so one of them's her autobiography. Many of them are actually short story collections, and then Christmas, like short Christmas novellas or Christmas short story collections. I somehow dropped the ball this past December on reading any of Goudge's Christmas works, and so I need to make sure that in December I'd pull out some of those Christmas books and read them of hers. But in the meantime, I have not read Towers in the Mist. So Towers in the Mist is one of those 3 cathedral trilogy books with The Dean's Watch and City of Bells. An editor decided to publish all 3 of them together and call it a trilogy. It actually is not a trilogy. I think they're all unrelated. There is a general theme of a cathedral in them, and so I think that might have been what the editor was doing. But this is, I think, Elizabeth Goudge's homage to Oxford, to a city that she loves, I've also read to poetry. I think there's possibly a little bit of historical fiction in there. So Elizabeth Goudge, want to make sure that I really work my way through her works because I'm very close to having read almost everything that she's written. Another favorite author of mine is Louisa May Alcott, and just like Elizabeth Goudge, I really want to be an avid collector and reader of her works. And I found Under the Lilacs on a bookstore that sells on Instagram, who now they have a website. They're actually doing really well. They have a lot of very unique offerings for fairly reasonable prices. And so I grabbed this before Christmas. And this is part of the Plumfield edition version where they have published a whole bunch of books that she wrote in this Little Women series. Although I think there are no Little Women characters in here. They're not the same. It's just sort of, again, this series that the publisher decided, hey, she found so much success with Little Women. We will just kind of continue that as a series. This was published serially in 1877 to 1878, so over a basically 10-month period. From what I've read about it, Louisa May Alcott herself, in her correspondence with a friend of hers, admitted that the plot, she was really kind of meandering with the plot and not sure where it was going. So I don't know if it's a lot of different vignettes of just like little stories about the children in this, but I am intrigued. I love the cover. I love the name, honestly. So I am planning on reading this. I also have a couple other older Louisa May Alcott in the same Plumfield edition versions that I am hoping to get to again as the year progresses. And then another classic female author is Elizabeth VonArnim. So I read Enchanted April and then watched the movie and promptly fell in love with her as a writer. She has a lot of different books, but I managed to get this Elizabeth and Her German Garden version used. I love this Virago modern classic style. They've since changed it. And so I love when I can find books that are in this style. And I am planning on reading this as we approach spring. Again, this is one of many of her books that I am hoping to be able to find. I found a few on Kindle. So I am really going to focus on reading more Elizabeth von Arnim. Next, we have the mystery category. And I have spoken about Edith Carolyn Rivet, who is ECR Lorac, before in my favorite books of the year, as well as possibly my December TBR. So I had a girlfriend who recommended one of her works to me. I read it and I fell in love. So I wouldn't consider myself a huge mystery fan. I do enjoy them, but I'm not sort of a prolific mystery reader. And I only have sort of found a few that I really love and I sort of latch onto those. And ECR Lorac is one of those authors. So I chose one of these British Library Crime Classics versions. Again, I found it used. I'm reading her books completely out of order. So my plan is to read Two-Way Murder, start there, and then continue to see what I have access to in my library and what I have access to as far as used books, and just make my way through her works. I again mentioned this in my favorite books video recently, but my plan is to just continue right on through with Mrs. Polifax. I was so surprised by this. Again, I read mysteries. A lot of times I'm like, oh, it was pretty good. But when I came across Mrs. Polifax, I absolutely fell in love. I will just continue to gush about this series. If you have not started reading it, I recommend at least giving this a try. I have started to watch the Angela Lansbury 1990 something movie that takes this. It's already taken some film license to change it, but I'm committed to it. I'm convinced though that the soundtrack makes it feel not as serious as I think it could have been. There's like kind of janky music in the background that makes it seem like that it's kind of a joke. Anyway, I do love Angela Lansbury and I do love Mrs. Polifax, and so I am committed to finishing that. But I have the other book, The Library. I just need to go and pick it up, and will continue to read through this series. I think it's pretty long, so I won't be able to say that I'm committed to finishing it, but I am committed to making a dent in it for as long as I'm really feeling like Dorothy Gillman has got Mrs. Polifax down as just such a phenomenal character. And then lastly, I mentioned Elizabeth Peters in my cozy mystery literary apothecary suggestions, I believe, over the summer. And I also really like her Amelia Peabody character. I'm guessing that she's not for everybody just because of her personality and kind of how Elizabeth Peters portrays her. But I've since learned more about Elizabeth Peters. In fact, I really should look up a biography on her if there is one. I find her so intriguing, and I think she's written parts of herself in Amelia Peabody, and I think that's also what I find intriguing. But her mystery books are phenomenal. I love the Egyptian backdrop, and I just want to continue reading more in this Amelia Peabody series. Within that mystery setting, and then kind of bleeding into the next category, which is more like literary fiction or a little bit more contemporary fiction, I have Mary Stewart. So I started with The Little Broomstick. I really enjoyed it so much. I love the Studio Ghibli, I think it's Studio Ghibli, Mary and the Witch's Flower. And then I have ended up reading a few others of Mary Stewart's work. Again, one of her books was in my favorites of 2024 video, and I love her middle grade. I have not yet read any of her mysteries, and so reading some of her mysteries is on my radar, and a hope that I would be able to find them and pick them up for 2025. And then I also have just some of her literary fiction books on there where they're just sort of adult fiction. I've got a lot of those on my TBR as well as her fantasy. I just love Mary Stewart and her prolific non-genre-ness. So she's written so many books in so many different categories that if you have specific, if you love romance or mystery or fantasy or middle grade, she has something for everyone. And so I just want to continue reading her works and finding beautiful vintage copies of her works to put on my shelves. Next, I have again, in that contemporary fiction category, The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyons by Beth Brower. Have really started reading this because Jen at Jen's Reading Life is doing sort of just this light monthly read of her work. She has, I believe, 8 of these out in this series with another one coming next fall, I think. And so we're just kind of going to be reading through it through the year. And I have already really enjoyed the first one. They do seem to get thicker as Beth Brower continues to write her. But the first one's very slim, and I think a pretty easy toe dip into you determining whether Beth Brower is an author that you would be interested in reading. But I did really enjoy this, and I am excited to continue to read more of her works in that Emma M. Lyon series. Next, I have Kazuo Ishiguro. I read The Buried Giant a couple years ago with a friend of mine. At that time, she had said Never Let Me Go was really great. Obviously, I'm familiar with Remains of the Day. I've seen the Anthony Hopkins movie, but I have checked this book out. I've mentioned it. I've checked this book out of the library many times and have not read it. Then I found this used. I have found them in little free libraries. I just keep seeing this book and holding it in my hands, and I am determined that I am going to read this year, and then also look for some of his other works that he has. I just love the obscurity of his writing. He has this ability to be very descriptive about something, and then after you've read it, you think, wait, is that actually what I thought it was? Or is there another meaning? Or what is actually going on? And that has been my experience so far. And I imagine that I will get the same in Never Let Me Go. Next, I have Eva Ibbotson. This is my plug for the Cozy Reader Book Club. We will be reading this in February. Journey to the Sea is also by Eva Ibbotson, and it was in one of our homeschool curricula a few years ago, and that's when I first became aware of her. And then I read The Secret on Platform 13, which, if you look at some of the aspects of the Harry Potter world, she obviously must have read Ava's Secret on Platform 13. It actually was written before Harry Potter. I think there was some inspiration there that was taken, but I have heard nothing but good things about A Company of Swans. And then again, after I finished this, I have loved what I've read of hers so much that I will continue to seek out her writing and hopefully make a dent in her works as well. Next, I have Alison Goodman. So this is actually the first book in a series. This is The Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies. So Alison Goodman has a very large breadth of work, and so I'm absolutely not opposed to reading other works of hers, but the one I'm specifically looking for is within the Ill-Mannered Ladies series. There is the Road Guide to Utter Ruin that is coming out in May. I believe she's actually working on a third book now. So that second book is going to be published in May, but she's currently writing the third book within this series. And in this, we follow 2 twins, and they are just a force to be reckoned with. They carry pistols. They can take bullets out of people. I think what I love the most is that Alison Goodman does not shy away from some of the hard topics in history, specifically in women history. For instance, in this book, she tackles women who did not necessarily behave a certain way or fit certain societal norms would get sent to asylums, and the conditions in the asylums were abhorrent. And this is something that actually really did happen, and Alison Goodman has her characters get right in up to their elbows into these situations. And so not only do you have these quirky, fun twins, there's a little bit of romance, but there is very hard-hitting historical fiction, and I am very excited to continue in this series. And like I said, again, find other books by Alison Goodman that I can also dive into and just continue working my way through her works as well. Olivia Atwater wrote Half a Soul, and then she currently has 2 more books in this Regency fairy tale series, 10,000 Stitches and Long Shadow. She also just wrote one last fall as well that I I'm not sure if it fits into this series, but if not, it's adjacent to this series. This is sort of a mix between Regency historical fiction and fantasy. It almost feels like magical realism, but there's too much fantasy elements, like for instance, fae, that can really make it fantasy. But if you're not a huge fantasy fan, I still think you would really enjoy this book specifically, and I loved it so much that I am hoping to continue on in her series and read the rest of them. My understanding is that we're not continuing to follow the characters in this, but that you sort of will see them from afar, and there are new characters that are introduced in each of the books. There's just really intriguing plot lines in here. So for instance, in Half a Soul, our female main character at some point in her life ends up getting partially pulled into the fae world, and in the process of bringing her back into our world, she ends up leaving her emotional part of herself in that world. And so she comes back into our world really not able to navigate nuances and being able to express emotion very well. She ends up going to a magician for help for trying to get that other part of her back. And it just feels very much like a character who maybe is neurodiverse. She's trying to figure out how to navigate in the societal norms of what's expected, what's not expected. And there also is, if I haven't mentioned, romance as well. There's friendship. It just is a beautiful book. It felt, my recollection is very wholesome. And so that's why I'm interested in continuing this series. I mean, it is Regency fairy tales. And so just a fun series, and her writing is wonderful. And so I'm really going to be looking to continuing through her works. Last category is fantasy. I love Naomi Novik. So I've enjoyed the fantasy works of hers that I have read. And then Tiffany Russell, who is here on YouTube and also on Instagram, recently started reading this series, and I managed to find them at a Second and Charles that I randomly had visited one day, and she raved about them. And again, I love Naomi Novik from what I've read so far of hers. And so I am going to go ahead and start the Temare series with His Majesty's Dragon. And my plan is, since I have the whole series, is to continue to make my way through the series. I love dragons and Naomi Novik, so this is a perfect match. Another author that I want to read more of is T. Kingfisher. I mentioned one of her works in my favorite books of 2024. Even more than that book, I enjoyed Nettle and Bone even more. I find her writing and plot and character development so intriguing, and I just have enjoyed the books of hers that I've picked up, and so I want to pick up more. I do want to be careful that I stay in her fantasy world and not getting into too much horror, because even her fantasy is not very delicate. There's some rawness and grittiness that she has throughout all of her books. Almost more in Nettle and Bone than in A Sorcerer Comes to Call. That's a lie. They're both really gritty. So I am going to continue to look for T. Kingfisher. I will be very discerning and make sure and research that I am reading her more fantasy-leaning books. But she's a very prolific author, and I should have no trouble finding something else by her that I love. Sarah Beth Durst, I talk about her all the time. I found this book, again, that fateful trip to Second and Charles that I took a few months ago. I found this used. It was a little bit damaged, but such a great price. I actually saw on Sarah Beth Durst's Instagram that they are republishing this series this year. She has a whole bunch of kind of getting a glow up on her a lot of her past works. But I do want to continue to read her books. I have another one that is not part of this series that is a standalone that I'm going to read this year. So I'm just going to continue to grab every Sarah Beth Durst book that I have access to and just slowly read through her works. And then last, this is actually not an author that I have talked about very much. I did mention Magic Lessons in my TBR, one of my fall TBRs. This is by Alice Hoffman. If you have seen Practical Magic from the 1990s with Nicole Kidman and Sandra Bullock, then you would recognize the story. And also, I understand they're doing either a reboot of Practical Magic or maybe continuing on. I'm not sure, but that's supposed to be coming. And I understand that Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman are going to be in this Practical Magic 2 movie. So I'm excited about that because I did enjoy that movie. Magic Lessons is the first book in that series. So it was weirdly published or written where Alice Hoffman wrote Practical Magic, and then she went back and wrote sort of the origin stories of what happened. And Magic Lessons is the story of the ancestors of the sisters in Practical Magic and explains how the curse came about. I have not read Practical Magic. What I've understand from the reviews is most people say Practical Magic itself, like you might as well watch the movie, that the book isn't as phenomenal as the other books in the series. So starting with Magic Lessons as my first book by Alice Hoffman, I loved this book so much. It almost did make it to my favorites list because it was just such a phenomenal read. There were a couple, I would say, pacing issues that kind of kept me hesitant from sharing, that it was a favorite, but I love her writing. I love her description. I love her character development. I love the plot. I love how she made a story that, if you've seen the Practical Magic movie, you think ended in sorrow, but in fact, she was able to kind of turn that around to be something that explains how practical magic could actually happen. Anyway, I loved this series and I'm going to continue, and I also have more Alice Hoffman books that I have found in used bookstores, and so I'm just going to continue to read her works and see if the love that I had of Magic Lessons flows through the rest of the series and her other books as well. So there you have it, over 15 authors that I am going to just continue reading through because I love them that much. If you've read anything by any of these authors that you really love and really recommend that I read, please feel free to leave that down below. If there are some authors that you absolutely love and you've read most of their works and you think that I would enjoy those authors, also please feel free to leave those below. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.